signed up for a series of lectures. So this lecture is going to be different, a little different from what you've been listening so far, because this territory is where we have ventured into very recently. So we've been doing data analysis and simulating for gravitational waves for a very long time. But today we're going to learn about the detectors itself. So it's a bit of instrument science. I'm not going to be talking much about capability and everything, but since we are going to have mega project and we are going to have to build LIGO India in India, so this becomes necessary that we build a scientific community that actually knows what the detector is all about. So, why am I talking about this? Because I'm someone who has been working with the detectors for quite some time within the instrument science group of LIGO. So, my background is not from astronomy or astrophysics. My background is totally from optics, lasers, and more of precision measurements. Now I'm part of the LIGO India detector, that is upcoming detector in here. Yeah. And then now we've started doing a lot of training and R&D because we're going to have a detector for ourselves. We'll have a detector that's similar to the one in US, but then we have to do our own upgrades and think about the future. When you build a mega project, you cannot just have a science run and then let it go. So you have to think more forward, which the LIGO collaboration has done for its own detectors in the past. So today we'll talk about four things. That might be too much, but I think it will give you a general overview of what we do as part of instrument science. And I want you to know that why we need such a very precision instrument to detect gravitational waves, and why a mega project, why put in lots of money and effort and push the technology to make the detector better. So for that, first we'll have an overview of gravitational waves. I think Dr. Mitra has given you an overview already. But we'll talk about the physical effects of a gravitational wave, because only when you understand the physical effects of something will you be able to design a detector. If you don't know what something does to you, it's really not possible to probe it. And then we know that it's widespread that it is an interferometer that does a gravitational detection. But what sort of intricacies go into designing an interferometer which can detect a gravitational wave? We've all built interferometers in our labs. You as part of MSc coursework, you as part of your lab work. But those don't detect gravitational waves. And what makes the detector special, and what are the upgrades that the interferometer undergoes so that it can detect the gravitational waves from the different sources that we're looking in terrestrial detectors. And then we look into the LIGO, advanced LIGO detector itself, its configuration. And since the detector is huge, it has to be divided into subsystems. And that's where it becomes a multidisciplinary project, because everyone with every expertise in physics comes together to build a gravitational wave detector, and the data goes to the astronomers to analyze and detect the gravitational wave eventually. Then last, we all know how an optical telescope works. You calibrate an optical telescope with closed windows, and then when you open it, what you see is what you look at is what is there. But how do you do that in terms of a gravitational wave? It's a 4 kilometer, 5 kilometer detector. How are you going to calibrate it? How are you going to detect the signal? So a little bit of how we do it. There'll be a follow-up talk by Dr. Shivraj, who actually does that, the detector calibration and characterization. So he'll talk more about it in his lecture. So to start with, I think this is what Dr. Mitra talked about in the morning, distinguishing how Newton defines gravity and how Einstein defines gravity. And the detection of gravitational waves come from this, right? That's what explains the source of a gravitational wave. So when you have a heavy mass, as it twists and ripples, it pulls the space-time around it, and then that creates waves around it. So it looks something like this. You have a heavy mass, and you have a space-time, and then when it moves around, it's actually going to warp the space-time around it. And how does such a gravitational wave? So there is a source that emits gravitational waves. You learned about the sources. And then now, what are the effects of gravitational wave? And this also, I think you heard about in the morning, that a passing gravitational wave actually stretches and squeezes. So in here, if you consider actually an array of test masses of freely falling bodies, which has no effect from anything else and just the gravitational wave passing through it, this will be the effect. So it will stretch and squeeze. And this is only for one polarization of the gravitational wave, the gravitational wave passing through the screen. And if you have to project it into three-dimensional, this is how it looks like. So as you can see, this is how it propagates in space. The points are connected just to give you, the sense of the warping. And on the sides, it looks something like this. So this is what a gravitational oscillation will look like. So we have, we know what creates a gravitational wave. And then gravitational wave comes in frequencies. I think this also was talked about in the morning. So we have gravitational waves in a range of frequencies, and you have detectors also that are designed to probe a particular range. And what we are going to talk about mostly is the ground-based difframeters, which will detect some of the phenomena that we have been detecting so far and we are yet to detect. So we have detected binary black holes and binary neutron stars mergers, but we're still looking for the other detections. And we're mostly looking into this range of frequencies that we're talking about in the few tens of hertz to few hundreds of hertz or kilohertz range. Okay, so the same thing put into a different plot will look something like this. So we have frequency along the x-axis, and then you have the strain. Strain is basically the amount of stretch and squeeze that the gravitational wave puts on the detectors. So as you can see that most of the ground-based detectors, you see advanced LIGO, and you have Kagra, you have the A+ upgrades, and then you have the Virgo detector, and then you have Einstein telescope and cosmic explorers. These are, some of them are proposed, some of them are planned. So the ones that we have, the ground-based gravitational detectors, and the names of which keep hearing in the scientific community. So we have the Hanford and the Livingston detectors in the US, and we have the Virgo detector, and we have the Kagra detector. These are fully functional detectors. And like India is the planned detector. And then we have, looking forward, increasing the sensitivity or detecting other sources. Those include the Einstein telescope in Europe, and then we have the Cosmic Explorer in the United States. These are proposed detectors which are not really approved. So if you look into how a gravitational wave detector looks like, it looks something like this. Like the whole configuration looks something like this. And in there, you'll be able to spot a microsync. And today we're going to talk about how we arrive at this complicated structure and why do we such a complicated configuration for detection. How many of you know what a Michelson interferometer is? Okay, good. So I think that's the majority. In a Michelson interferometer, you have a laser, then you have a beam splitter that splits the beam in two directions, throughout the whole direction. And it goes back and then comes back and recombines at the beam splitter. And what you see at this output port is either a constructive interference or a destructive interference, depending upon the phase difference of the light that comes back. So as you can see, when there is constructive interference, you get a bright fringe. And then when there is destructive interference, you have a dark fringe. So this is basic. So now we saw what a gravitational wave does to a freely falling masses, ring of freely falling masses. So if you have gravitational waves passing through an array of freely falling masses, the masses would actually get stretched and squeezed. And that's what you see in this. This is exactly what it does to a ring. And if you skip forward, and if you were to put an interferometer and assume that the two end mirrors are actually freely falling masses, then a gravitational wave that is passing through the interferometer would stretch one arm and squeeze one arm at the same time. And if you consider a gravitational wave passing through you, which is strong enough, then we would all be stretched and squeezed like this. So that would be the effect of a gravitational wave on any mass that it travels through. So finally, if we have an interferometer, if we have a Michelson interferometer, and we have a gravitational wave going through the interferometer, then what we detect at the output port is actually a phase measurement. So the information about the gravitational wave is embedded in the optical phase change that you detect at the output port. So this is a concept that created the birth of LIGO. So gravitational wave and its physical effect on an interferometer. But you should see that in the initial days, and even now, we call it a detector, but actually the detector is more like an antenna. See here, it says a proposed antenna. It doesn't say proposed detector. So this was one of the first proposals that was submitted for bringing up LIGO. And here also you can see there's a laser, there are two masses. And then it's called a proposed antenna because depending upon the orientation of your detector, the detector has its own response function, which is not a circular 360 degree. It has lobes depending upon the way the detector is constructed. And so its response is not the same to a gravitational wave that comes from any direction. So that's why in early days, people proposed it as an antenna because it has its own pattern, like the antenna that is built for communicating in FM and AM. So here we see actually what we see is the electric field that comes from the laser, and then it gets split into two halves, and then recombines back, and then you have a phase difference. And if you are going to take the x-axis as the difference in length delta L over lambda naught, and this is how the intensity pattern that you see. And in gravitational wave detectors, this output port, we call it the dark port because we try to. So if you have a bright port, which means that all the laser light that you put in is going to be there in the detector. And we need to design a detector that is going to determine something at the peak of something, right? So which means that it's going to be flooded and saturated at that point. So most of the time we talk about the detector at the dark port and we look for minor changes in the phase, which comes as an intensity change in the photodetector itself. And if we have a gravitational wave, it's the strain that we talk about, H, which is the difference in length over the entire length. So as you see, the strain is actually inversely proportional to L, which is the length of the arms of the detector, which means that if you have a longer baseline, you get a better strain measurement. So how do I design? So what do I do to decide the length? I know that a longer baseline is going to give me better detection, but how long? So that we have to work out something. We'll learn where that comes from, where we got our secret number of 4 kilometers, or where we made the adjustments, and why the new detector is 40 kilometers, like that. So I think all of you know this, right? You define an E field, E0, E I omega t, and then if it propagates over a distance t, and this is what you get, right? So this is what you see. Yeah. So this concept is good enough for you to understand how the interferometer works and how it responds to incoming gravitational waves. So now you have a laser, and then you have the incident field in here, and that gets E in, and then that gets split into two. So you have this E in by root 2 and E in by root 2 because intensity and goes by the square root, you get the field. So E in by square root of reflections. Then it travels a distance LA, so which means it accumulates a phase, and then LB along LB again accumulates a phase, and then returns back, and you get the 2 LA here. Same, you get the 2 LB here, and the combined intensity at the output port will be given by this. That's clear, right? You can stop me anytime you don't be lost. So if I'm going to define the phases phi A and phi B that the light accumulates over the whole round trip of the well, then my E output is. And then if I finally have to calculate the power, the output intensity, you see that it's actually a function of phi A minus phi B. And if I have to plot it, so phi B times phi A, if I plot it, this is how it will look like. And the distance between the peaks is actually 2 pi. So what you can see is that the output intensity is actually sensitive to the differential phase, and it does not depend on the common phase. So if you have a Michelson interferometer, and the Michelson, as we call it, breathing, so if both the lengths change simultaneously, that is not going to be sensitive to a gravitational wave. It's only the differential length, differential phase that matters. So the common phase is not what we are concerned about at all. So you have the phase difference, and then now you calculate the effect of an incoming gravitational wave given by h of t, and h of t is defined by h naught because the gravitational wave has its own frequency we talked about. So if you define it as h naught e I omega t, then the phase comes out to some function here, and the gravitation. So this is what you get. So I've taken it here, and so now if I have to plot frequency versus frequency of the gravitational wave and the phase response on the y-axis, this is how the plot will look. I'm plotting this function. So this is what we call a frequency response. So when you, for example, when you have, how many of you are familiar with the term frequency response? It's new, most of you. So suppose I have a pendulum. A pendulum has its own frequency, oscillation frequency, right? It has its own, has a maximum amplitude. And suppose at the point of contact, I am putting in a noise at some particular frequency. And that will trigger the pendulum only at frequencies where it has its own resonance at its peak. So if you're going to draw a frequency response for a pendulum like this. So if this is my F and this is my amplitude response. So it looks something like this, which means this is my resonance, which is determined by the pendulum's internal resonance frequency, and then this falls over as 1 F squared. So if my noise comes at some frequency, roughly around here, then the response will be more. But if I'm actually going to consider the noise that comes in the higher frequencies, it totally suppressed by the pendulum. So by taking an object which is sitting on the table and hanging it, I create a suppression in noise that the pendulum will react to at a higher frequency. So which means the pendulum is not going to react to any frequencies in this range as it would if it is going to be a freely falling mass, right? So this becomes very important for us. This is one of the important concepts that LIGO is designed on. So this is what we call a frequency response of a simple pendulum. And now if I'm going to look at the frequency response of an interferometer, this is how it looks like. So you have the gravitational waves coming in these frequencies, and the response of my interferometer will look something like this. So what you can see is, so I length. You have 75 kilometer interferometer, and then you have a 4 kilometer interferometer. As you can see that the DC response is either longer or larger. So you have to make a trade-off between both. And then the other fact is where you have this cutoff frequency, because it is not going to respond to frequencies beyond this one, right? So there's a cutoff frequency that is also to be determined. And then the cutoff frequency could be either or it can be lower. So you have a choice to make. So if I'm going to detect a gravitational wave at 1 kilohertz, the Michelson arm length, so you can see where it's 1 kilohertz, right? When I have the peak response. So if I'm going to detect it, the arm length that I need is roughly 75 kilometers. But that's too long, right? 75 kilometers would mean you're digging through a lot of earth to make a straight arm because light travels in straight lines. So you have to dig through here to get a 75 kilometer arm. So there are two ways you can do that. One, you include delay line arms. Pulls the light that goes into the arm cavity and make bounces back and forth and then recombine it. So this is called the delay line. The other one is a fabric arm. How many of you have heard about fabric? Okay, that's also a good number. Good. So what we do is we put in a partially reflecting mirror in one of the cavities, and then we make the light bounce multiple times, and then you collect the light at the output. So these are the two ways you can resolve this problem of 75 kilometers. So, but what does it do to the response? Because we had looked at the frequency response of a Michelson interferometer. Now I make it a Fabry-Perot Michelson interferometer. What we call it as FPMI, Fabry-Perot Michelson interferometer. So what does that do? What does that frequency response will look like? So what we do is we look into a Fabry-Perot cavity. So here is what a Fabry-Perot cavity looks like. You have the input field, and then you have a cavity of length L. T and R are the transmission and reflectivity of the surface of the mirrors. And then R is a reflected field, T is a transmitted field. So it's the same planar wave equations that you've done before. So if you do the same exercise all over again, you'll be able to find the field build up in the cavity. So you see these rises in the E field. This is what the plot looks like. So you see these peaks, and the phase response will be sharp at these differences. So I'm defining a parameter called finesse of the cavity because every Fabry-Perot cavity is defined. It's actually a measure of the losses in the cavity if you want to think of it in simpler terms. And in here I'm assuming that the loss is coming only from the mirror properties, R1 and R2. I'm not including any other facts of scattering or diffraction. None of that is being included, only the reflective, considering an ideal situation. In that case, my frequency response becomes something like this. So as you can see, the blue actually is a Fabry-Perot arm length of finesse 450, which means it's a very low loss cavity. Higher the finesse number, lower the loss in the cavity. So 450, and then we have one that's 50, and then we have the simple 4 kilometer Michelson. This will allow you to So a simple 4 kilometer microsync looked like this, right? The response was very low. The magnitude of the response was very low. But then as you increase the finesse of your cavity, of the fabric cavity in the arm, you get a better DC response. But you have a cutoff frequency also that becomes moves to the lower frequency side. So a fabric cavity increases the stored power in the arm. It increases the accumulation time of the signal. And then if you are going to increase the finesse in beyond the roll-off frequency, where beyond the cavity pole, even if you're going to increase the finesse, there's not going to be much difference. They all behave the same, as you can see. Above the cutoff frequency, they all behave the same. So now this is how it would look like. If I have a fabric microsync, then I have a delay line microsync. The delay line comes because of the number of round trips. What you saw in a fabric interferometer, if you tone it down, it will be a delay line interferometer. And then you have a microsync that we talked about in the first slide. So what was a single microsync now has become a fabric interferometer. And this is the basic form of most of the gravitational wave detectors. But in the first slide where I showed you the overall configuration, you didn't look. There were some additional mirrors. And so there are two other important mirrors that you see, at the input and the output side. So what we've done is we've taken a microsync interferometer and the fabric cavity and made a fabric microsync interferometer. But then we include two other mirrors, and these mirrors are called recycling mirrors. We talk about what the recycling mirrors do. So optical recycling was also another technique so LIGO is a few decades old. It started with, I showed you the proposal of a single microsync, then it became a fabric microsync, and then still the sensitivity was not good enough. And then we had to add the optical recycling capsules. So, as I told you, the microsync interferometer is operated at dark fringe. So if this is dark, where does most of the light go? You are having a powerful laser at 150 watts going inside. And all you see at the output is darkness, right? And energy has to be conserved. Where does it all go? You have hundreds of watts of light just disappearing, right? So if you think of it, it is all going back to the laser, because if you have a dark pole here, you have bright interference happening at the other port. So it goes back into the laser. Parts of it goes inside, okay? And so what we're doing is we're putting a mirror in here, again a partially reflecting mirror, and then recycling the light that comes from the interferometer. So whatever light you get, even though you have a 150 watt laser going in, you can build actually a few kilowatts inside. So now you given most of the light back inside. So now all the light is contained. There's no light that comes out of the beam splitter. There's no light that comes out of the two reflective mirrors. So where do you think the light goes? Any ideas? There's no light coming from anywhere. Whatever went to the laser sides, they blocked it with a mirror and sent it back into the instrument. There's no light anywhere. So where do you think the light will come?
It's just inside.
Then we should just explode, right, at some point.
Right.
So in ideal cases, you call these high reflectance mirrors, right? But those mirrors come with losses. And then there's scattering that happens at the surface of the mirrors. The scattering that happens from what is inside the vacuum chamber, the other auxiliary optics. So most of it is just lost. It's lost in the losses of the interferometer. There's no one particular pole where the light all beams out. It's lost within the interferometer, slowly lost within the interferometer. So the main process where the light actually goes out is absorption and scattering. So the interferometer consumes all the power that there's no point where it builds up. The build-up is done. So there is a stationary phase of the interferometer where the build-up and it's stable at that point. Beyond that, the only losses are absorption and scattering that happens at the different components of the interferometer. So if we have to design a power recycling mirror, we can consider the whole FEMI as a 3-mirror cavity, which means if I can consider this whole thing as a fabric mirror cavity. For example, if my microcell is aligned and I have a dark mode output, then the whole interferometer will look like a highly reflective mirror, because it is just giving back all the power to the laser side, right? So the whole thing can be considered as a cavity which reflects all the light. And the finesse of this cavity that we build, so how the power recycling cavity is designed, is based on the finesse of this cavity that we come about. If we have a high finesse cavity, then it looks like a 3-mirror cavity. But we have a low finesse cavity, then it looks like an arm cavity. And this is the one that is sensitive to the differential motion. So how we design the power recycling mirror and what's the build-up that we keep depends upon how sensitive it is to the differential motion. So you saw there's another mirror also here. This is called a signal recycling mirror. Although it's called recycling, it doesn't have anything to do with recycling like we saw in the power recycling mirror. In here, what happens is more of a tuner to the detector. So for the signal recycling mirror, the whole interferometer acts like another compound mirror. So in which case, if for the common mode, it looks like a high finesse 3-mirror cavity, and then for a differential mode, it looks like a low finesse 3-mirror cavity. It is always a 3-mirror cavity in this case, so not like the other one wherein you have. So what this does is, if you want to know what practically we do with the signal recycling cavity, more of tuning. So you saw the frequency response earlier of a high finesse Fabry-Pérot microphotometer. So when you have to, so here what you see in terms of tuning, what we call as phase, is basically the length is converted into phase. The length of the signal recycling cavity is converted into phase. So which means you saw the difference of 2 pi, right? So you go over 2 pi, you've actually traversed through the curve. So we talk about displacement of, or the length of the signal recycling cavity in terms of phase. So when you do that, actually you see resonances or anti-resonant signal recycling. And once you hit pi, you see a resonant extraction. And why this is important is because if you are looking for a source of gravitational wave at particular frequencies, if you're looking, you know there is an event happening at some particular frequencies, it allows for the tuning of your interferometer to look at that event with higher sensitivity compared to the other bands. So this is done in the detector so that you detect particular types of events, and you can tune. It's just like the radio, right? So you tune for particular frequencies, like the tuner in your radio that allows you to tune the frequencies and see the resonance. So that's what this does. So now we've come to understand what a dual recycle Fabry-Pérot interferometer does. So you have the laser, and then you have a bunch of input optics that condition the laser because you want the laser to be stable that goes inside. It's because the information is there in the phase of the light that comes out from what goes in. So it's tuned at the input cleaner. And then you have a Faraday isolator because you don't want the light to come back into the laser. And you want also a port wherein you see what is coming out of my interferometer because that has information. So that happens here. And then we have the power recycling mirror. And in here, as you can see, the power recycling mirror, there are two additional mirrors. Basically, the length of the recycling cavity is determined by what we saw earlier, right? The length determines whether you have a high finesse cavity or a low finesse cavity. So we have these folding mirrors that adjust for the length change that we need. So the overall, it makes a cavity. So you can just consider the total length as like 1 cm. And then you have the bead splitter, and then you have the ITM and the ETM in here. The ITM is called then the internal test mass and the end test mass, input test mass and the end test mass. And you have the X and Y. There's a power buildup of 750 kilowatts and the 4 kilometer arms. And then what you have at the output is again a signal recycling mirror. You have the folding arms of the signal recycling cavity. Then you have a Faraday in here to also look at what goes back. And then we have an output mode here. Again, some sort of cleaning is done to the light that you're looking back because the light that goes in gets scattered into the other modes of the higher order modes, and it's very muddled up what you see at the output. And basically, it's a cavity that takes look only at the TM0 mode, which is the pure Gaussian mode. And then you have the gravitation wave readout at the diode. So the interferometric detectors that we have right now, we have LIGO Hanford and LIGO Livingston. They have 4 kilometer arms. They are in the DRF PMI configuration. We have the Virgo, it's 3 kilometers in HP, and that is also in the DRF PMI. We have Cabra, which is 3 kilometers, again in the DRF PMI. And then we have 0600 in Germany. And this is a delay line spectrometer, which is 600 meters long. There's one bounce, extra bounce. It's 300 meters times 600 overall. So, as I told you, there are different parts of the interferometer. As you see, it just gets complicated and complicated. And but every component is important because we want to make a detector that can detect the strain coming from a gravitational wave. Then there are multiple subsystems that you look into. So the first one is the pre-stabilized laser, the laser itself. It's not 150 watt just coming out of one laser. So a lot goes in. So it starts with a 2-watt laser, and then there is a mid-level amplifier that takes it up to 70 watts. And then we have the final amplifier that takes it up to all the way up to 140 watts. And then we have the input optics, which actually conditions the laser before it enters the vacuum system. So here we have a mode matching lens that actually makes sure that the light that goes in is like Gaussian. And then we have an input mode cleaner here. So just like the output mode cleaner that we have in the output, we have an input mode cleaner. And this is a 3-mirror suspended cavity in vacuum. So which means the noise is actually suppressed. Whatever goes in, much more pure than what you get here. And there are loops that run intensity and frequency stabilization for the laser in the input optics part. And then we have the core optics components. We have the actual optics, which play a really major role. So the ITMs that we saw, 40 kilograms, which is really huge. And then the diameter is 24 centimeters, and thickness is 20 centimeters. And as you can see, you saw all the major mirrors listed in the configuration. And here you can see the specs. So the ITMs and the ETMs are the important parts because they are the ones that actually interact with the gravitational wave signal. And they are important to find out the differential motion of the interferometer. So the signal lies in there. So these are the largest ones that you see. And then we have the bead splitter also. And then we have the power recycling folding mirrors in here, and the power recycling mirror and the signal recycling mirror itself. So it's very important that these mirrors have very low loss, and also they're polished to give low scattering and low mechanical loss, because that decides the efficiency of your interferometer. So this is what it's like: 34 centimeters, 20 centimeters. 1 kilogram mass. So the way these are evaluated is there is this instrument called zygo, wherein you you're putting in the gas mass, and then you look at the surface of this and look for the minor variations in the. It's basically again a phase measurement of light that falls and comes back. So you can see the minor changes in the on the surface, and that's 42 kilograms substrate. And then after it's polished and coated, it looks something like this. And for transporting, so you need to keep the mirror clean. You don't want any dust or any particles falling on it because any miss and we put 750 kilowatt on the mirror is just going to explode and leave a mark on the mirror. It happened during the first run. During the first observation run, it did happen that there was a particle on the mirror and then it exploded. So what we do is like there is a what we call first contact. It's more like nail polish. You just pour a bottle of it over the mirror, and then you can see that's what she's spreading. So you make a uniform layer, and then it dries out, and then that's how the mirror is transported and then mounted in the suspension system. And then the last thing before they close the chamber is this peel coming off. And they take the peel off and then they check it with UV light to see for anything that remains on the surface. And actually, it was a point of like this first contact that was stuck to the mirror that was not properly screened or missed during screening. So then we have the suspension system. The suspension system is one of the important subsystems because you want a mass that is isolated for the higher frequency noise. It works in the same principle of like 1 over f squared. But in case of the actual LIGO mirrors, they're not a simple pendulum. There are multiple stage pendulums. So for example, for the test masses, there are 4 actual pendulum stages. So as you add a stage, the response actually falls off. The noise that the response actually falls again, or 1 over f squared again gets added for every stage that you add. So the final stage of isolation that you see is 1 over f to the 8 in LIGO. In Virgo, there are 7 stages. So it's a 7th stage, so you have 1 over f to the 14 isolation that you get. And you can see, depending upon the importance of the mirror and how much it needs to be isolated from the seismic and other noise sources, the pendulum stages also differ. And the way they're suspended, only the test masses actually they have glass welding, and you have fuselator. Fuselator is basically glass. So you have glass rings that are welded to the sides of the mirror. The mirror is just suspended. The other single stage suspensions are more like wires, a few tens of microns, depending upon the weight of the mass and how much motion it has to see. Because if it's too stiff, then it's not going to respond to a gravitational wave that's coming. So that is a very important factor. So this is how a quartz suspension looks like. So this is stage 1, this is stage 2, and then you have stage 3 and stage 4 of that. So that's how a test mass will look like when it's suspended inside the chamber. The next subsystem is the seismic isolation subsystem. You have earthquakes happening everywhere, and you have people moving around everywhere. And there's a feedback system that actually, like, the seismic isolation setup that we have actually helps in reducing or reducing most of the seismic noise by feeding to the suspension system itself. So there are 2 types of chambers in LIGO. One is like the BSC chamber, wherein we have the buses, suspensions, and everything. And then you have the single stage suspensions and other auxiliary optics and hand type of chambers. So it's horizontal axis, and then you have the just. Next is the auxiliary optics subsystem, and this combines many components in the interferometer. some used for monitoring, some used for correcting for errors in the configuration itself. So that includes scattered light control, because once your light goes through and it's scattered off multiple components around, because you still have that traction happening and components around the object. So that needs to be observed. We don't want amplification of those and those getting into the interferometer, which means if they get into the interferometer, what you see is more garbage at the output port. So this is one of the major sources of noise that we see in the detector. So they have impactive baffles that can absorb light right away. And then we have optical lasers. So now that the mirrors are inside, how do you probe the motion of the mirrors? So you have a mirror, so we have what are called optical lever systems, where we have another helium neon laser that actually goes and falls on the mirror and then reflects off of the mirror, and it's detected on a quadrant photodiode with 4 parts. And depending upon the position of the reflected light on the quadrant photodiode, you can say whether the mirror is moving, whether it's moved up and down, sideways, so that the angular control of the mirror is done to that. So that is the optical lever system. And then we have the output mode feeder. I've talked about that. Then we have the thermal compensation system. So you saw behind the ear there is like another mass in here. And this is what it does. So what we do is, so you have lots of light going in, accumulate, right? So as there is power buildup, there's heating that happens. And when there's heating, structure warps, right? So the same thing happens. The curvature of the mirrors that these were designed for changes as you build up on power. So you want some mechanism to compensate for changes in the radius of curvature of these mirrors, so that you get enough build up as a fabric locality. So that is what this does. So we have a CO2 laser that's protected and that generates enough heat to actually warp the mirror, so that we get back your resonance for the particular, because as you change the radius of curvature, the cavity becomes resonant for other higher order modes rather than the perfect Gaussian. So to bring it back, that's what you do. You heat the test mass back so that you get the right curvature. And then we have the arm length stabilization system. So we talked about one laser that goes into the 1064 nanometer laser that goes into the interferometer. There's also another 2 lasers in green that are actually probing. They are more like probes of the 4 kilometer arms itself. As you can see, we have these many mirrors, and there are so many coupled cavities, and everything should come into resonance at some point. So to control, have enough time on the detector. So this arm stabilization system is very helpful because it removes the arms, 4 kilometer arms cavity, and then you have only the center of the Michelson interferometer that you have to control. And then once you have control over the center of the Michelson interferometer, then you bring the arm cavities in a more controlled fashion, because you have the control using the arm stabilization system. You do a control switch to make it into more complicated configurations. So then this is more important. This is most important. So you put stuff inside, and then now you need to sense the different lengths and control the different lengths. And you can see that it's a phase measurement. So the linearity that you see is like very minimal. So you should be able to sense the different lengths as well as control and bring them all together in a controlled fashion so that nothing gets thrown off. And also when your interferometer loses lock, you should be able to bring it back quick and in a more controlled way. Suppose there is a very high magnitude earthquake and you lose lock, we call it lock. When it's controlled state, we call it the lock state of the interferometer. So when you lose lock, you could bring it back to a controlled state. And that's what ISSAA does. So it runs several length sensing and angular sensing loops, and it's also sensitive to the physical environment management. Suppose there is a construction work that's going on, that also has looped into. For example, we are worried about there's a dam next to the detector that we're planning now. How does the storage in the dam or the outlet from the dam affects it? So that has to be monitored. Then you have monsoon season. In monsoon season, the wind direction is different. So the building shakes. So the effects of all that has to be taken into account. Then we have the next one is the controls and data system, what we call CDS, because you accumulate a lot of data, and then you need to be able to control the subsystems in real time, because your system is inside a vacuum chamber, and you have to be able to sense and control in real time. So, what the data acquisition system that we have at LIGO is one of its own kind. It's not the one that you find in all laboratories most of the time. And here are some pretty pictures of the detector. So here, what you see is, so this is how it looks like in the center building. What we call it as the LEA. So you have the laser, you have the detector, and in these two chambers, what I told the tall chambers, that's where you have the ideal in here, and then you have the 4 kilometer round. So this is how the 4 kilometer round looks like. And then this is one of the auxiliary outputs chambers. This is a two-stage chamber. So we know what now an actual gravitational wave detector looks like. So we have a high power laser, we have more cleaners, and then we have the arc cavities, subliminal arc cavities, then we have the recycling mirrors, and we have the signal without steam, and each of these mirrors is actually a suspended system which has its own vacuum envelope, has seismic attenuation using PSAI. We have a suspension system, and then we have the 4 optics in here, which are all coated and buffeted, right? So now, how do we detect gravitation? We have the instruments here. So how are we going to calibrate our detector? How are we going to detect a signal that's coming through, that's passing by? As I said, like in terms of an optical telescope or any telescope, you close the telescope and then you know what the detector is detecting, and then open it, and then you know what is outside, and then subtract, get what you want, right? So that's not as simple in case of the gravitational wave detector. So we have a continuous stream of signal that's coming in, and then the gravitational detect wave is actually a noise, is covered in noise most of the time, and even the detector, the noises that are made by the detector can be misconceived as gravitational wave signals. So if you want to detect these gravitational wave signals with very high accuracy, what you have to do is reduce the noise around it, which means reduce the noise from the detector, coming from different parts of the detector. And that's what, so if you reduce the noise levels, then you can reach farther. So it goes as cubed. So if you reduce the noise by 10 times, your reach in the sky for detecting gravitational wave signals moves as RPE. So what we have to do is, now to know that if you are going to detect a gravitational wave, you should know what are the noise coming from different parts of the detector, so that you can keep them in a controlled fashion, so that when a gravitational wave comes, you should be able to see a strong signal with a very good SNR. So we have different components. There are different components from which noise comes from. And how do we monitor the noise from? So what we basically do is hunt for noise from all these. And this is what we call commissioning phase of the detector. Okay? So you've got all the fantastic optics, fantastic laser, suspension system, everything is done. You put everything together. It's not like Lego, like put everything together and it works. It doesn't happen. So the installation phase of the detector is very small, and the commissioning phase of the detector is the longest. And it takes few years before you can commission the detector. It's not a one-year job. It builds up its steps. So what commissioners do is basically noise hunting in the detector. They look for sources of noise from all the components around it. So before you look at that, first you should know what you're expecting detector, right? What is the noise level of the detector that I expect? So what we build is like make a noise budget. and the noise level that comes from different sources. So we categorize. So you have different components, and we categorize the noise based on the sources of noise into these categories. So, you have quantum noise. We'll talk about the details of these noise. I think Dr. Shivraj will talk about the details of what each noise source means. But most of them are pretty straightforward to understand. So seismic noise, know that is, right? And then we have gravity gradients. Which is this, if someone is going to go stand next to the PTN, or I put a heavy truck near one of the end test masses, how is that going to affect my detector? Because the gravity is different, right? There's a gravity pull from the detector, from the truck to my test mass. So that comes in gravity. So there's a gradient in the gravity that it experiences. But we've not reached those parts yet with the detector right now. So gravity gradient is something that the future detectors have to worry about. But we still account for it. So what we do is we look for the noise sources from different parts of the detector. You can see the suspension thermal noise, which means that as you heat up, suspension starts, there's a thermal buildup in the suspension. So because the mirror doesn't give away everything out, so it propagates through the suspension. So you have a suspension thermal noise, and then you have the coating Brownian noise. So coating actually, like at such high power, it becomes more of a liquid, right? So there is Brownian noise that comes from that. There's thermal noise that comes from that. So that that is actually one of the key factors that current detectors are working on, and they're highly, as you can see, you see the red line that is actually affecting, taking most of the contribution. You take the contribution of each noise source and say 100 hertz, and you can see that the major contribution is the quantum noise and the coding noise. The quantum noise is one that people are facing now in this current generation of detectors. These are the two sources that people are battling with right now. And they were not sources of noise that they were battling 10 years ago. Sorry, 20 years ago. In the earlier versions of LIGO, people didn't worry about quantum noise as much because the noise from the other sources, seismic and everything, was much higher. So when we upgraded, when we had heavier masses, then the noise sources that we worry about also change, keep evolving. So what does the sensitivity now look like? So as you can see, these are actually the measured noise curves of the LIGO Livingston and LIGO Hanford. So what you have is the displacement, because that is what we're looking for, right? A relative displacement, delta L. So this delta L, and then there is frequency along here. And you can see that there are different noise sources in here, and the final measured noise. And you can see there are different noise sources that contribute. There's noise, frequency noise, there's gas noise, there's even scattering, and there's some controlled noise that comes in. So what do we have of the current century? So now we are in the fourth observation run. It starts on tomorrow, 23rd. So we've been in the engineering run phase where we're trying to tune the detector and get it ready for observation mode. So we've been on engineering run mode the last month, and the actual run starts tomorrow. So we've had 3 observation runs where we had the whole stellar graveyard of events that we have detected. And as you can see, we will have observing runs till we actually hit the advanced LIGO proposed sensitivity. So what we call the design sensitivity, that comes from the projected noise budget that we can put forward, taking into account the current technology and the current limitations that we have. And then this is already approved. The next upgrade is already approved. So then that is what A plus will do. We'll have heavier mirrors, change in coatings, and those are currently being explored. Nothing is finalized. And we expect that LIGO India will come up with this design sensitivity. So, so people are already thinking about future detectors and how they can be improvised because it's a large scale detector and planning starts like almost a decade in advance because each subsystem has to be upgraded and the limitations has to be pushed. So you saw in the earlier videos the Cosmic Explorer, the Science Fan Telescope, and then we have the A plus system. Voyager is again another upgrade where you're thinking about cooling the mirrors by keeping them in a cryogenic environment. So you reduce the noise that comes from the coating significantly, and also it's changing its wavelength to a wavelength where there is less absorption by the gas mass itself, because as you saw, the coating thermal noise where it absorbs the substrate absorbs the light, the heat from the laser that's there inside the kilowatt power that affects. So that this is the Voyager timeline. But as you see, so now we are A plus is here, O2 is here, and then we're somewhere in between. So as you can see, like our reach in redshifts actually to detect binary black hole mergers and new constant mergers just keep increasing for future detectors. So C1 is Cosmic Explorer 1, C Cosmic Explorer version 2 that is being projected. So to summarize, what we've seen that gravitational waves are actually a space-time frame, and then it has a quadruple squish and stretch pattern. And then we talked about laser interferometry, where we saw how a microwave interferometer can detect a gravitational wave. Then we saw how we arrived at the complicated DRFDMI pattern. And then we saw a little bit about the subsystems and how technology is being pushed to get more sensitivity out of the interferometric gravitational wave detectors. And then we talked a little bit about noise and sensitivity, and that's what decides what we detect and what we see and how much it's an order to detect. So what we do here at IUCAA preparing for LIGO India is we have instrument science labs that are coming up. We have students who work with us to get trained in the LIGO technology and a little bit into looking into the future of R&D and how LIGO can be commissioned. So you are most welcome to come and visit our labs. You can drop me an email if you would like to come and visit our labs. So if you're free, you can always, if you want to come as a group, that's fine. We take you around, shows what we've been doing. So this is fairly new at IUCAA. We've been doing it only for the last 3 to 4 years. So we just started exploring, and now that we have the approval to go ahead, we're hoping things will get accelerated at a much higher rate. We have students already work on small scale projects, and we have students who do their master's thesis with us. So thank you. Any questions? What is quantum? Okay. So quantum noise is something that generates from the quantum nature of light. So you have the laser that's going in, and then the particle nature of light comes into action. So you have a photodetector that's detecting light at the output port, it's detecting the phase negativity, right? You have the uncertainty principle that actually decides as to how certain you can find the phase difference. But there is a way of action. So there are two sources for us. One is the short noise and two quantum noise sources. One is the short noise and other is the radiation pressure. So short noise is the counting noise, right, that you get at the photodetector. And how can you reduce short noise? By increasing the number of photons. So statistics will help you reduce the noise. If you have a counting noise, that's the number of photons that comes in. then if you increase the number of photons that's falling on the detector, you automatically, by statistically, you reduce the short noise that you have. And then the other source of noise is the radiation pressure, which means as you have a buildup in the arm cavity, so this arm cavity that you have will actually like experience pressure from the photons hitting on it, which means there is an oscillation, a spring radiation, a spring constant attached to the motion of the arm, and this also comes into play. So and these happen at two different frequencies. The short noise happens at more of the low frequency ranges that we're talking about in the detector, and then at higher frequencies is where the radiation pressure happens. So what we do to control short noise, we increase the power in the laser, so you have more number of photons. And then for the radiation pressure, what we do is called squeezing. So you have this uncertainty that defines a loop on the intensity and the phase. So if you have an E field, then you have an uncertainty that defines the intensity and its phase. So what we do is we change this light so that it has less uncertainty in phase and more uncertainty in intensity at the higher frequencies. And then we do the reverse at lower frequencies. This is what we call squeezing. So it's basically you're changing the uncertainty circle that you have in the quadrature to squeeze in the direction where you have lower noise. So basically when you have this that is defined by H cross, right? So you have phase and intensity. So one is intensity and then one is the phase. So what I do is I squeeze so that's my uncertainty in phase registers. So these are again not sources that we worried about in the earlier versions of the detector because the noise that they bring in, as you can see in the quantum noise. Yeah. Quantum noise is the ray line. So you see this ray line, right? So these different sources get added up, and you can see the magnitude of the quantum noise is quite larger than what we are trying to detect right now. So you can see the major contributors. What are the major contributors? Say like at 100 hertz, major contributors are mostly coming from the thermal noise, the seismic, and quantum noise. So every time we budget for the noise, whatever noise source limits us, we work on that. And this observation run, what we're trying to increasing the squeezing helps us. So we have a way of changing this quadrature that we're looking at, and that's what we call the squeezer. And that squeezer reduces the noise by a few dB. The measurement of how much reduction you get is done in dB. So the O3 had roughly, I think, 3 dB, and now we're targeting roughly around 6 dB reduction in this. And we also do, so if you just do only squeezing, which we call as frequency independent squeezing, then we get reduction only in the radiation pressure. But when we do frequency dependent squeezing, wherein you adjust the light at the lower frequency, at the lower frequencies, it's a different quadrature that you put in, and at the higher frequencies, it's a different quadrature. So then you get frequency dependent squeezing. So which means that you're able to reduce the noise overall in the bandwidth of the detector. So that's what we talk about. That's what we're worried about in this case, and I think that's what we've addressed in this observation run.
You said in the beginning that in the future you'd have like space-based detectors.
Yes.
Is that to account for this kind of noise, like to decrease the noise?
So, as you saw in the gravitational wave spectrum, the space-based detectors are of a different bandwidth.
Right.
So, the limitation that we have in our ground-based detectors is the seismic noise that happens at frequencies around hertz and millihertz levels, and that we cannot escape a terrestrial detector. And what a space-based detector does is just remove that. There's no seismic noise that comes in, and which means that you will be able to detect noise sources, which means you'll be able to detect sources of noise in the millihertz region. So what we have in here is like hundreds of hertz, kilohertz, gravitational waves. But then when you go to space, you get a different range of gravitation, bandwidth, gravity. These are also like we have ISSAA, which has been approved, the initial version of the space-based interferometer. That is, there are several other. Let's see, there is. So, here, ISSAA is here, and then you have the Chinese detector here, and then this is the Japanese detector, the cycle. So these are actually space-based detectors, the range is space-based. This is actually nice to look at. So if you go to this website and then click on the different projects that are there, to show you the sensitivity and you can plug them on. And you can also put the different sources in to see which source, something to play with. So, are there any others? Yes, please.
How do we find from which batch size?
So, as I told you, I thought I won't talk about it, but I told you that the detectors are more like antennas that we have, and there's little you can do about changing the orientation of the detector on Earth. You have a 4 kilometer by 4 kilometer stretch, which itself sets a limitation on where you can put it on the Earth. Right? You cannot just have much flexibility on orienting the detector. But so gravitational waves do have polarization, it's plus and it's cross. And then when you look at the response of an interferometer to gravitational waves, you see that if you have to orient the detector right as a plus, means face off, then you have the maximum response for when it comes straight on you, like the picture I showed for the interferometer. When you have a plus that goes through the screen, that's when you have the maximum response. But if my gravitational wave is going to come in a direction which is like somewhere in where it has a zero response, okay, the blue regions are the region where you have zero response, then the gravitational wave goes undetected. This is where the global network of detectors comes into play, because each detector has a different geographical position as well as a different orientation, and that helps in localizing the sources and also getting a better SNR. So there is a possibility that one detector detects it and the other doesn't detect it at all. There is a possibility. So, which is why a network of detectors is what people push for, and the networks have to work together. So, like right now, LIGO, Virgo, and Hubble work together, and as you can see, they're all in the northern hemisphere, and the localization gets better with LIGO India basically because of its geographical orientation, much south into the southern hemisphere compared to the other detectors. You want to get a 4 kilometer by 4 kilometer detector, it's hard to find a place where you can put the detector, wherein you can acquire the land for 4 kilometers. So which is one of the troubles at Cosmic Explorer. Cosmic Explorer says my arms are going to be 40 kilometers. Where are you going to put the detector? So people are investigating into solutions like that. It's mostly practical limitations that set. And if you ask if we looked into how we orient our LIGO detector, we did not, because acquiring 4 kilometer land was itself a challenge. 4 kilometers is quite long, right? So you want a straight arm that goes through 4 kilometers, you have to dig to Earth anyway. and you want to make sure that you don't have any seismic sources around it. So you want a region which is fairly isolated from human activity. And all those were taken into account when they were looking for the site. And the directionality was not a priority anytime because you have other logistical problems. So there are any questions in the chat. Okay. Can any other technique be used other than interferometry to detect gravitational waves? There are. So interferometer was not the first that actually came into play when people wanted to detect gravitational waves. The initial